When working with word problems, it's really important to pay attention to the order in which a problem or a question is written. This particular problem talks about somebody going through a valley in a nearby mountain range, and it gives me their altitude at different checkpoints. The question itself is how much lower is checkpoint 5 than checkpoint 2? The way this question is written is not necessarily the way that we write our mathematical expression. The way I would recommend that you think of it is, let's pretend like we have this question instead. How much lower is the number 2 than the number 10? If you think about how we would approach this problem, we wouldn't write 2 minus 10 because that would give us a negative 8. So how much lower is 2 than 10? We would do 10 minus 2, which would give us a positive 8. So even though the order of the numbers is a 2 followed by a 10, the way we write our expression is we write the 10 first and we subtract a 2 from it. In the exact same manner, how much lower is checkpoint 5 than checkpoint 2? We're going to take the altitude of checkpoint 2 and subtract it from the altitude of checkpoint 5. So checkpoint 2 is negative 58. So I am going to write negative 58 first. And I'm going to put a minus sign because I know I'm subtracting. If I look at checkpoint 5 is another negative number. So we're actually going to write negative 176. It's important to keep both of these negatives side to side. You don't want to turn them into one huge negative sign. They're two different negative signs or minus signs, so we put them next to each other. So right now this is our expression, and we're trying to figure out how much this is actually equal to. So our next step would be to rewrite this expression. That does mean that I need to change the way that this looks. That doesn't mean I'm going to make it into a huge negative sign, but anytime you have two negatives or two minus signs next to each other, you change it into a plus sign. So this original expression is actually negative 58 plus 176. And this is the problem that I really want to focus on. I'm going to go ahead and cross out or mark out the other expression that I had, just so that it doesn't confuse us. If we are able to add these two together, then we would get our final answer. Now I say the word add, but really there is a plus sign in the center. But if we look at the signs of each number, the 58 is negative, the 176 is positive. Because they have opposite signs, we're actually subtracting the numbers. So we're doing 176 minus 58. If we go ahead and do that subtraction, 16 minus 8 gives us 8, 6 minus 5 gives me a 1, and then we have a 1. We end up getting a 118 out of this. Now when you add and subtract numbers, you got to make sure you have the sign of the larger value. The larger value is 176 and it was positive, so our answer is going to be positive 118. For part B, it tells us that the top of the hill rises 541 feet above checkpoint 5. Anytime we're talking about something being above the other, that means we're going to be adding it. So we're going to take checkpoint 5, which is 176 or negative 176, and we are going to be adding it by 541. Just like part A, we end up having a negative number and a positive number. Because they have opposite signs, we are going to subtract the numbers together, even though it looks like we would be adding them. So 541 minus 176, if we do the math, when we subtract these numbers, we try doing 1 minus 6, but we can't do that, so we gotta borrow a place value from the 4. The 4 would turn into a 3, and the 1 turns into 11. 11 minus 6 is 5. We move on to the next value. 3 minus 7 we cannot do, so we gotta borrow a 1's place from the 5. Becomes a 4, and the 3 becomes a 13. 13 minus 7 gives me a 6, and 4 minus 1 gives me a 3. So my final answer ends up being positive 365. And we know it's positive because the larger of these two values is 541, and 541 is positive. So our answer is positive 365 feet. So this problem gives us a table of temperatures in different cities at 6 a.m. on the same day. Part A tells us that by noon, the temperature in Chicago has risen by 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So if we look at Chicago, Chicago is at -2 degrees at 6 a.m. So by noon, it's going to go up because it's rising by 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So part A wants us to take -2 and add it to 9. Because these have opposite signs, we're really subtracting the numbers. 9 minus 2 gives me a 7, and the larger of these two values is the 9, and the 9 is positive, so our answer is positive 7. That would be the answer to part A. For part B, they ask us how much lower was the 6 a.m. temperature in Toronto than in Springfield. The temperature in Toronto is -18, and the temperature in Springfield is 31. Because we're looking at how much lower the temperature would be, we are going to have a subtraction going on, but this is not the way that you would write it. If we go back to the previous example of this, how much lower is 2 than 10? The actual math that we're doing is we're taking 10 and we're subtracting it by 2, because that would give me the number 8, which is the answer to this question. So even though this is written as the temperature in Toronto then in Springfield, we're going to flip the order of the numbers around, just like I flipped the order of the numbers around for this example. So instead of writing it as -18 minus 31, we're going to write it as 31 minus the temperature in Toronto, which is -18. So this would be the proper setup to the problem. -31 minus -18. Anytime we have two negative or two minus signs right next to each other, you change it to a plus sign. And when you change it to a plus sign, there should no longer be any negatives between the numbers. That means that this would become 31 plus 18. We can now ignore the original problem because it can confuse us if we're looking at the negatives. And we'll notice that our problem only has a plus. It's a simple addition problem where you take 31 and you add 18 to it. 31 plus 18 gives me 49, and that would be the final answer to the problem. For this last problem, part A tells us that the top of the hill rises 539 feet above checkpoint 4. So checkpoint 4 is -175 feet above sea level. The hill rises above this. That means we're going to put a plus sign, and we're going to add it to whatever the problem tells us. And in this case, they use 539. Similar to some of the previous problems, we have a negative value and a positive value. This means that we're really subtracting these two numbers from one another. So what we can do is we can rewrite it as 539 minus 175 and do the subtraction. 9 minus 5 gives me 4. 3 minus 7 you can't do, so you borrow a 1's place from the next digit. The 5 becomes a 4, the 3 becomes 13. Now we can subtract these numbers. 13 minus 7 gives me a 6. 4 minus 1 gives me a 3. So my result, or my answer for part A, ends up being 364. Now you do have to go in and make sure that the sign of this result is correct. And the way you do that is by looking at these two values. The larger of the two numbers, ignoring the negatives, the larger of the two numbers is 539. And 539 is positive, so that tells us that the answer is also going to be positive. So that's how I know that my final answer is going to be 364. Part B asks us how much higher is checkpoint 2 than checkpoint 5. If we consider the example from some of the previous problems, it would look like this. How much higher is 2 than 10? But as a statement, this doesn't make any sense, or it kind of doesn't make sense, because 2 is not higher than 10. So we can think of it this way, as how much higher is 10 than 2? If we do that, our setup to turn this into a mathematical expression would be taking 10 and subtracting it by 2. In other words, the order of these numbers would be exactly the same in our expression, because 10 minus 2 should be an 8. So unlike some of the previous problems, for this problem, how much higher is checkpoint 2 than checkpoint 5, we're going to keep the order of those checkpoints. We're not going to flip them around, but we're still subtracting the values. So our expression would become checkpoint 2, which is -59, minus whatever checkpoint 5 is. And checkpoint 5 is negative 123. Notice that I wrote down the negative and it's next to a minus sign that we had already written. At this point, we can rewrite the expression. So instead of having those two negatives next to each other, we can change it to a single plus sign. So our expression would become negative 59, and instead of minus a negative, it's going to become a plus, and 123 remains the same. So now I'm going to ignore my original expression because it can look a little confusing, and we can just focus on this, negative 59 plus 123. The signs of each number is different, they have opposite signs. That means we're going to subtract the numbers from one another. So 123 minus 59, we go ahead and do the math. 13 minus 9 gives me a 4, and 11 minus 5 gives me a 6. So we end up with a 64, and 64 would be the answer for part B.